Hey folks, welcome back to the Podcast Digest. My name's Dan Lisette, and thank you all very much for taking the time to come back and listen. This is episode 137. Really excited about this week's show, a recent debut that has really taken the charts by storm, and for good reason, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But before we begin, as I am wont to do, I'd like to thank just a couple of quick people. First, all you wonderful people over on Patreon. If you guys would like to support a small independent podcaster trying to stick around in this game, I would really appreciate it. You can do so over on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Link in the show notes. And also to this week's show sponsor, Fireside is back once again. Fireside is podcast hosting and analytics platform created by podcasters for podcasters, and I'll tell you more about them in just a little bit. Let's get to this week's show. Mark Ramsey is the host and one half of the amazing new show called Inside Psycho from Wondery. I was able to sit down and talk to Mark about all that went into this amazing show. The production values, the research, the writing is extraordinary, and I'll let Mike share all of that with you. So without further ado, folks, let's get to this week's conversation with Mark Ramsey from Inside Psycho. All right, folks, welcome back. And as I mentioned in the intro, my guest this week on a show that is completely unique and something you must be listening to, and we're going to dive deep into it, Mr. Mark Ramsey from Inside Psycho. Welcome to the Podcast Digest.
Hello. Thank you.
Thanks for joining me, Mark. I do want to thank the folks over at Wondery for reaching out to me and telling me that this wonderful show was coming and put it on my radar immediately, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And we're going to talk all about it for the three folks who haven't checked it out yet.
Would that it were true.
Yeah. But before we jump into the show, I always like to do is to let folks get to know a little bit about yourself personally before we jump into your work. So way before Inside Psycho, can you tell folks a little bit about yourself?
Well, let's see. I have been working in and around the audio space for many years. And I think also I'm on the board of the Broadcast Film Critics Association. They're the folks who produce the Critics' Choice Awards, which this past year ran on A&E for movies and television. So I get to be in the big room of movie stars every year and TV stars and so on. And it's really an integration of those two things. My presence in the audio space, my interest in that space, my love of particular movies, and also I think feeling that there are kind of unexplored directions in audio. There are things that audio can do that are interesting that maybe aren't really explored right now, and that's the opening, I think, for Inside Psycho.
Yeah, and there's a lot to talk about with that. But I got to ask, because I've said this many times, I always estimate somewhere around 50% of my audience are other podcasters, is what I speculate. And so many independent podcasters, and I'm sure you're well aware, are movie or TV show fans. So if I didn't ask you this question, I'm going to hear about it from somebody. So let me ask, how does one become a part of the Broadcast Critics Association?
Well, you have to qualify, and you have to submit an application, and you do that at the website, which is criticschoice.com, and there are a lot of digital folks that are submitting nowadays, and but it's really a function of kind of your level of influence, your level of credibility, your level of commitment, and are you actually doing movie reviews? I mean, it's for critics and television reviews. Although I should say on the television side, it's really there are two organizations. One is the Broadcast Film Critics Association. The other is the Broadcast Television Journalists Association, because we recognize that, for television, it's more the business of television, the ongoing content. It's less criticism per se. So there are those two groups. You just need to apply. You can see what the qualifications are and determine whether or not your platform qualifies.
Interesting. Oh, I was just curious. When I asked, I actually didn't even know it was something that was even open to folks. I was just curious sort of how you had actually made it into that particular group.
Well, years ago, I had years ago, I got my start in the digital space, really, because I had a platform that was a movie satire site at a time when, making websites was in itself a big deal before social media. Right. Remember those days?
Yes.
And that was, I would say, in the late 90s, maybe.
Yeah.
And I created a site called Movie Juice, which was a satirical movie review site. The whole point of the site, in fact, was a send-up of movie reviews. It was an effort to say, these people are full of crap, and, it was just satire in the purest sense. And it became kind of a thing for a while. Its first year, second year, I can't remember which. There was a magazine at that point called Yahoo Internet Life. And the film critic for that magazine was a guy named Roger Ebert. And yeah, he had a column. He was a columnist. He was obviously.
I heard he did a few things. Yeah.
Yeah, so he had a column there on Yahoo Internet Life. And at one point, those were also the days when there were lists of like the 10 best websites for this, the 10 best websites for that. And Roger had a category called the top, what was it? The top 20, I guess it was. And mine was number 2 in the category of online outlaws, right behind Harry Knowles and Ain't It Cool News. So,
wow.
So it actually made the rounds quite thoroughly. I remember once at a Critics' Choice Awards, I got to meet Steven Spielberg. You get to meet everybody at those things. And I handed him a card, and he said, "Oh, Movie Juice." And I said, "Oh, you read it?" He said, "Yeah, I like Movie Juice."
Wow.
And I said, "Wow, okay, that's kind of cool."
Yeah,
Steven
that had to be
Spielberg
cool.
likes Movie Juice. I can use that copy point. So it really made the rounds at that time. And then, time passed. I did it for a number of years. I did it probably for 10, 15 years. And then it became clear that, this isn't how things are working anymore. And this isn't how people are getting their information anymore. And now there's a whole new generation of people who talk about this stuff virally and do it across all kinds of different platforms. And, you got to know your moment. And so that's when I moved on to other things, and but I was still at that point entrenched as a member of the Broadcast Film Critics Association and ultimately on the board. And I'm kind of the guy who has some awareness about audio and digital, and that's my space on the board.
Oh, that's a great story, Mark. I'm glad I asked you that. That's a great story, and I'm always amazed. I've been doing this long enough on this end now where the interconnection between some of my guests is amazing. A previous guest of mine, Andy Anatko from the Chicago Sun-Times, a big tech podcaster, and he was fairly close personal friends with Roger Ebert, and we talked a lot about that on our episode as well. And it's just amazing how, somebody like that could have, which was probably why he was considered to be the giant that he was, right? How many touch points and connections he had throughout the industry and beyond. So
yeah, it's really amazing when you're, and there are very few kind of, bigger name above the title names in organizations like that, because there are very few critics nowadays that are really nationally known, because the opportunity for the Siskel and Eberts just, everyone is a Siskel and Ebert today. There aren't any more Siskel and Eberts. But people like Roger was never part of BFCA, but Joel Siegel was. Joel was with ABC and Good Morning America for a number of years. I had a number of conversations with him before he passed away a few years ago. And Joel was always really, really supportive. And it's nice to get strong support from somebody who is really well regarded in your category. It's a good thing to remember, regardless of where we are on the totem pole, that if and when you are lucky enough to become a big deal in whatever you are lucky enough to be a big deal in, don't forget the people at the bottom, because as the saying goes, you will pass them on the way down.
Yeah, that's for sure. That is for sure. Or the related one is you never know who will be your boss someday, or what. I'm slaughtering that.
That's true.
You never know who you'll end up working for, or something to that effect. But well, that paints a little bit of the backdrop inadvertently on sort of your movie credibility, if you will. Let's shift gears just for a second and talk about audio storytelling and audio production. You mentioned you've been in and around that space for a while, and I know that you've got another show as well. But when did your interest in audio begin, and how did it begin?
Well, from my very beginning, let me go way back. When I went to college in upstate New York at Cornell, and Cornell is in Ithaca, New York, which is where Rod Serling's from. Rod Serling is like the most famous guy from Ithaca, and of the Twilight Zone. And at that time, You couldn't really get TV beamed in. That was pre-internet. There wasn't a lot of cable around. You just didn't watch it. You had to actually deal in the real world with real people. And the biggest media there was the radio station, which was run by students. So as a result, to work in radio at that time for that station in that town was a big deal, and a lot of people trudged through there. Before me, a few years before me, Keith Olbermann was there. He's probably the best known alumnus of that radio station today.
Right.
And a lot of people who work in the radio industry today spent their time going through those four walls at one point or another. And at one point, in fact, when I was a student there, the alumni would come in and do gigs on the air. I was normally doing news. And every so often we would have these alumni come in, and once this guy from the network, it was Keith Olbermann, he came in and he did sports for me. While I did the news. He was a big shot at the network at that time, but he was only at the radio network. He wasn't yet on ESPN. He wasn't, MSNBC, any of that stuff. He was just, bigger than anybody else. And I remember listening back to the audio afterwards when I threw it to Keith, and I would hear my voice going to Keith's, and Keith's voice, you can't really tell from television. Keith's voice on the radio is like the voice of God. And listening to the transition between mine and his, I thought, well, there's no future for me in that medium, that's for sure. So that was just, so since then, though, it was a big deal. And, if you were on the radio station, you were the prime entertainment thing for people in Ithaca. For people, it was a big deal. So that kind of started my career. I went on to business school and studied market research, and a friend was really a fan of radio. He said, well, why don't we do a study for a radio station? And we did. And then I went looking for people who did that for a living, and ultimately I became kind of a strategy consultant advisor to broadcasters. And that started my career in the audio space. And between then and now, obviously the parameters of audio have changed a lot. Audio's evolved a lot. Audio's grown and expanded a lot, into streaming and podcasting and a bunch of other stuff. But what stayed with me from then till now is that audio can be kind of uniquely powerful. There is a power to audio which largely has been forgotten by the people who make their living at it. And that, I think, is an interest, and that goes from advertisers to broadcasters, really across the board. Even the advertising that's in podcasts nowadays is pretty mediocre stuff. No more mediocre than what's on radio, I might add, but really not less mediocre. And it really raises the question, well, if consumers, if people view advertising in any of its forms as irritants, why don't we do something about that? Why don't, if so much of what's there is pablum, why don't we do something about that? And I wanted to kind of illustrate with this show, among other points, that you could really create some amazing impact with audio. And thanks to my, incomparable production partner, Jeff Schmidt, he made that possible. I wrote for audio, but he produced what I wrote.
Right. Yeah, I was going to bring up Jeff as we jumped into Inside Psycho. What I'm curious about, and what we're going to dive into here, is when we're going to talk about a lot of those production values and how this happened. But I'm trying to bridge the gaps here chronologically and try to get an idea of how much of a leap this was for you, if it was at all, knowing that you have another podcast that I mentioned to say that this is sort of a conversational podcast, if you will, and now you've got this huge writing heavy, production heavy, sound design heavy, research heavy, wonderful product in Inside Psycho. And I'm just curious, when you decided to embark upon this, did it seem daunting, or were you ready to take on the challenge?
Well, it seemed daunting, and I think one of the best things that you can possibly do is not know what you're up against when you're up against it.
Ignorance is bliss.
Well, I mean, for example, when Jeff and I, I had the idea, I presented it to Jeff, he liked it, and I said, are you game to produce a teaser? And he said yes. So we produced a spec teaser, basically, that was about 5 minutes long, and that's the calling card we used, and that's actually on the feed. That's the what I refer to as episode 0. It's the teaser that introducing Inside Psycho on the feed. And that was our calling card that we used to sell the show. And ultimately, it did sell the show. And the minute it sold the show, I had to sit there and realize, now I've actually got to write this. And it turned out to be about 180 pages of copy I was writing.
Wow.
And it was all dialogue. So it was really pretty overwhelming, to say nothing of the production time. Jeff invested 5 hours of production time in that 5-minute teaser.
Jeez Louise.
I mean, it's an immense amount of effort wrapped up in this show, and it's done for a number of reasons. It's not the most flush job in the world, but it reflects a lot of passion. And, nowadays what people respond to is passion. People can smell passion.
Right.
People can appreciate something that is created with tender, loving care, that is not just another widget off the shelf, right? And I think that's what we wanted to do. And that combined with wanting to make the point that this was even possible, because my observation is that the breadth and depth of podcasting is shockingly thin. That a lot of what's there, a lot of what people consume on it is, as you put it, conversational audio. Conversational audio is great. It's fine. There's tons of it on the radio. But it's not inherently special, right? Not unless there's, that one end of it is, a superstar. Someone there's Kim
Mark
Kardashian.
Maron. Right, Mark Maron.
Yeah, Mark Maron's on one end. And it's not just Mark Maron. It's Mark Maron and Barack Obama. It's Mark
Exactly.
Maron and. Every time you hear a Mark Maron interview, it's about the interview subject, and it's debatable whether the primary draw is Maron or the subject or the conversation between the two. It could be any of those three or all of those three.
Right.
And there's a lot of that out there. And there's a lot of that out there that isn't Mark Maron and isn't Barack Obama. There's a lot of that out there that's next tier. That's and I think there's so much of that. I looked at what's on the iTunes charts and I asked myself, is this America? Is this really the extent of what people are interested in? And then I asked, how come what we watch on television seems so different from this to a large extent? Where's that element? Where's the stuff that is cinematic, that is theatrical, that is, not radio theater necessarily, which I'm really not a big believer in. But where is the kind of the stuff that puts you in the middle of something compelling? That's not just, here's the news of the day and it's disposable tomorrow. That's not just, here's an interesting interview and it's great and so on, but I can hear that interesting interview on Terry Gross's show. I don't need to hear that interesting interview on 50 other shows. And that's what occurred to me, is it just seems kind of shallow still. When people say to me, there's a big market for true crime on podcasting. I say, you mean since Serial? Well, that big market existed before Serial. Now people are made aware of it. It always was there. I mean, you could see it on Dateline NBC
Right.
every week. That's true crime. There's tons of true crime on television.
Yeah,
There's
and
always
if
been
you go
tons
into
of true crime.
Yeah, and that's sort of documentary style, especially if you go into literature and in books and things of that nature. True crime's always been a thing there, and so on and so forth.
Every genre is represented, but not every genre is represented in podcasting with equal verve. And that was the observation. I mean, what are the TV shows ripped from the headlines? Remember that? Well, what is ripped from the headlines? It's true crime. So
Yeah.
I think people need to realize there's more formulas out there. A lot of what's out there in TV and film, for example, is people talking about, it's chat shows about The Walking Dead or chat shows about Game of Thrones or whatever, which are good as far as they go. But is that all there is?
Yeah,
is that
I
all
think
there
some
is?
of those specifically, I think is a backflow from podcasting, especially when you look at somebody like Chris Hardwick, who came from The Nerdist and has really built almost a visual podcast when you think about something like Talking Dead, because there are 1,000 Walking Dead podcasts, and he was able to convert it into something that people watched on television.
Yes,
it's interesting. A lot of what you're referring to is sort of the flow of the appeal in the television or film medium hitting into the podcast world, and that's one example of sort of, I think, where it kind of went back the other direction for once.
Well, that could be, but also he's got a panel of stars from the show
that's true.
and from elsewhere sitting there on the couch next to him. So it is more than just people talking about a show they love.
Yeah.
So again, this is not to diminish any of that. This is only to say that there's got to be more than that. And when you look at the things that people are most interested in, it's just a richer palette. So I wanted to do something that didn't sound like an audiobook. I wanted to do something that didn't sound like a chat show podcast. Again, not to diminish it, just to say that there are more formulas than what we're seeing playing out at the top of the iTunes charts.
Hey folks, let me jump in and tell you about this week's show sponsor, Fireside. Fireside is a podcast hosting and analytics platform. It's created by podcasters for podcasters, guys. It's a brand new offering in the hosting space. This was started by Dan Benjamin. He's the founder of 5x5, previous guest as well on the Podcast Digest. If you guys want to hear more about Fireside and all of that 5x5 does, you can check out that episode. But Dan's taken everything he's learned since 2009 by making podcasts for a living, and he's turned it into a platform that anyone now is able to use at any level of expertise. And Fireside has all the big features that all of us as podcast hosts are really looking for, right? Unlimited uploads, unlimited downloads, all kinds, massive amounts of real-time data and analytics about your unique downloads. It's got a super fast CDN for the best download speeds. That means when your listeners go to download your new episode, it's going to come to them super fast. Multiple podcast support if you've got more than one show. Free one-click podcast importing from other platforms like Libsyn, FeedPress, Simplecast, SoundCloud. If you're coming from one of those places and want to try out Fireside, one click gets it all over. Custom domain mapping. If you've got your own website, you can link it up, your own URL, I should say, and you can link it up to their beautiful, responsive website. It's going to have your own artwork on it, your own host and guest pages, tons of advanced features like sponsorship integration, chapter markers, a bookmarklet for links, auto posting of future episodes, time code linking, and just a lot more. I mean, so many features that actual podcasters really want to see are in there. Now, you can try Fireside for free for 7 days, during which time you can import your existing podcast for free and take advantage of all the features Fireside has to offer. The unlimited plan starts at $19 per month and no commitment or long-term agreement. But if you go to fireside.fm/TPD, you'll get to take their tour, look at all the beautiful screenshots. And if you use the code TPD, you're going to get 20% off the standard plan for your first 3 months. You can't beat that deal, folks. And seriously, if you're thinking about starting a podcast or you already have one, you owe it to yourself to check out fireside.fm/TPD. Fireside's by podcasters and for podcasters. And my thanks once again to Fireside for supporting the Podcast Digest. Now back to the show. So let's go back to then. Let's go back to when you were determining what you wanted to do. How did this idea sort of gestate and come out, and why Psycho?
Well, okay, those are two questions. So why this idea? I knew that there were stories to be told around these movies that were interesting. I knew that there were stories to be told that people didn't know. And in general, people never know them, not unless you're, a geek on the subject. But this Inside Psycho isn't made for Psycho fans. It isn't made for Hitchcock fans. I don't know how much of what's in here is new to those people. This is really made for fans of the genre. If you're a horror fan, if you're a movie fan, I suppose if you are a true crime fan, you might appreciate this. But more than that, I mean, you've been through the whole series. No one else has because it isn't all posted as of now. But I think what you're going to find when you get to the end, and it would be interesting to discuss this with you, but I think you're going to find that this story is bigger than a Psycho story, that this story is bigger than a horror story, that this story is
completely agree.
Not just a narrative of what happens behind the scenes. When I got to the end of this, and I was cognizant of this as I was writing it, let alone performing it. When I got to the end of it, I realized that this is really the journey of a hero named Hitchcock, and it has ups and downs. And what you realize when you get to the end is that the first half of it is Hitchcock building up to this unlikely success, and I mean unlikely with a capital U, because everyone around him told him this would be a failure, and he had every reason to believe that they were right. Every reason to believe that they were right. And the fact that he had to that his studio turned their back on it, that he had to rush off to Universal, because Universal would gladly take Hitchcock as long as he had money, and he did have money. And he retained all the rights to this movie, and he basically paid for the movie to be made, and in return he took all the chances. I mean, think about that. This is a guy who had made some of the biggest movies ever, who was renowned around Hollywood, and no one would make his movie. He had to take the reins himself, and this was at a time when that just wasn't done. Why in the world should this be done by someone of his stature? And yet, that's what he did. He was sensing a change out there. So he took his TV crew, he took them to Universal, and in the space of about a month, he created this movie, and then by the end of it, he wasn't altogether sure that it wasn't a huge mistake. He actually considered, and this is in one of the episodes, he actually considered stripping it into segments and turning it into his TV show.
Right.
Actually cutting it up and making it parts of his TV show. He actually considered that. Psycho. So I think there's that nobody knows, and then, or that most people don't know. And then once he did it, once it became a huge hit against any measurement, a hit much bigger than any of his previous movies or any movie he would make ever again, then he had the inevitable problem that I get into in, I think, the next episode, the one that hasn't published yet, and that is, what do you do for an encore?
Right.
How do you top that? And this haunted him. He was literally condemned by his great success to follow it, and he couldn't do it. The Birds didn't anywhere near approach what Psycho did. Nothing else he did thereafter approached what Psycho did, and there he found himself, and I tell this story, I think, in the final episode, on the Universal lot in 1975, making Family Plot with Bruce Dern, which I don't remember offhand how much money that movie made, but there he was on the Universal lot, and Bruce was asking him, hey, this up-and-coming young director, Steven Spielberg, wants to meet you. And Hitchcock said, I couldn't possibly meet him. The boy who made the Fish movie is the way he put it.
Right.
And why couldn't he meet him? Well, because, first of all, Hitchcock had taken $1 million to be the voice of the Jaws ride at Universal Studios. And here he sat as he did that, and he viewed himself as essentially a whore for doing that. And he watched as Family Plot, his movie with Bruce Dern, made almost no impact at all on the box office. Meanwhile, Spielberg's little Fish movie was, a legendary success, getting, tens of millions of dollars, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars more than what Family Plot was doing. This was where he was at this stage in his career. This is what it had come to for him. This was the thanks he had gotten for everything he had done. This was his raw inability to equal the success he made with Psycho. This is where he was at this. And in the midst of all of it, he never, not once, earned an Oscar for his work.
Yeah. That was an amazing story, too. Yeah.
He never, not once, earned an Oscar for his work. And I tell that story. That's at the end. And I think it takes you on the whole arc of this struggle. And I think anyone who's ever tried to make something, anyone who's ever tried to create something, anyone who's ever tried to start a business, who's tried to write a song, who's tried to write a book, who's tried to create a film, anyone who's ever tried to do anything like that, where they've put themselves into something and then thrown it out into the world and hope for the best. If they haven't had great success, they shouldn't be surprised. Then they'll appreciate the first part of this show. If they have had great success, then they'll appreciate the real challenge, which is keeping that success going, sustaining it. And that's what haunted him so much. So the journey that he follows, the great success and great struggle, is one that anyone who's ever created anything can understand. So I think at the end of it, what did he have? Well, you know what? More than anything, he had the woman beside him who had been there all of his professional career. He had his wife. And that story is so much bigger than the story of Psycho. It's bigger than horror. It's bigger than narrative. It's bigger than anything. And it's a story, I think, that takes this to a whole different level that a lot of people can appreciate. It's a human story.
Yep.
And that's what I wanted to get at with this more than anything.
Yeah, quick aside, Family Plot grossed 13 million, Jaws 260 million. So good old IMDb. But so the question is all these other elements that folks have heard a little bit in the first 4 episodes and they're going to hear more of, and you alluded to a little bit in episodes 5 and 6, was it the totality of that story that sort of drove you to more than just a minute 1 to last minute of psychoanalysis? Because you could have told just sort of a making of within the film itself, but it did go much broader. Was it that sort of intrigue that led you to approach it that way?
Well, making of isn't a story. I mean, you got to find the story, right? And what I didn't want to do is a shot by shot. I didn't want to do here's what happened in the shower scene and that's all this is about. I mean, all of that stuff can be done. It's been done before, but it's really for cineasts. It's really for film school buffs. It's not for the rest of us. And I wanted something which was designed to appeal beyond the parameters of people who are film nerds. And although it can also, I hope, be appreciated by those folks too. And that's what I set out to do. So from the very beginning, I knew that I wanted this to be more expansive. And I really wanted to use audio to go everywhere and do everything and tell every little aspect of this. So we're literally around the world in this show. One particularly glowing review that I really am humbled by from IndieWire said certain aspects of it were reminiscent of Fargo, the TV series Fargo, which I really, I think it's just absolutely humbling because Fargo is such an extraordinary piece of work. But I understand where the comment's coming from because it's coming from the sense that Fargo, goes through a number of different characters, a number of different scenes, and a number of different time periods in order to tell its story. And that's what I try to do here. The story is not linear, not particularly linear. Hitchcock dies in episode 2, and he's back in life in the same episode. So it's intentionally that kind of, I really try to keep it interesting by going all over the place while not making it confusing, and I hope I achieved that.
I'm glad you mentioned the IndieWire review because I'd actually read that in preparations for our conversation, and they did bring up anything. I'm scanning through. Yep, there we go, to make sure I didn't mix this up. But they do mention something in there I wanted to ask you about because there is a lot of things that you had creative choice in, and I kind of wanted to dive a little bit deeper on. One of them was, I'm pretty sure this is the review, now I've lost my thread here, but there is very little, and maybe none, but very little, no, I can recall at least one, use of the audio from the film itself in the way you decided to tell this story, and I'm sure that was a conscious decision. Can you talk about what went into that thought process?
Well, there are two things. First of all, there is no content from the film, so whatever you remember hearing, you didn't hear.
I think I'm thinking about in what people have now with the shower scene on episode 4. Maybe I'm thinking of part when you talk about the music. I thought there was something, but nope. I could be wrong. No, okay.
Not one note. There's not one note and not one bit of audio from the film. Well, nor is there any actuality. There are no quotes from. There are 6 words of dialogue that happen in the movie, but I speak those words, and those happen later. And there is intentionally no audio. Part of the reason is that we're talking about something so familiar that everyone has seen, heard it before. That's one reason. The other reason is pure rights issues. To use that kind of stuff requires having some kind of sync rights. And I wasn't. I mean, this is not that kind of a budget procedure.
Now, would be nice though, right?
Well, I don't know about that actually. I viewed it more as a constraint that creates creative possibility. And that's, infamously how constraints are. Some of not to compare, but some of Orson Welles' greatest moments in film were made because he didn't have the money, the resources, or the time to do things the way that would have been ideal. There are a lot of shadows in Citizen Kane, and that's because there were no walls there. So that's just one example. Or there's another movie that he made later where he made it over the course of years, and he had, actors were dying while the movie was still in the process of being made, and he had to make do with wherever he was at any given point in time. And, they were in like bath towels because He couldn't afford costumes, or the costumes didn't get there. So constraints can be freeing. But it's also true that this was not an attempt to mimic Psycho. This was not an attempt to, replay for you the things that you already know. This was not a highlight reel. This was an attempt to tell a story about a story you know. And under that scenario, why should I use the audio? Why should I use the actual voice of Hitchcock or the voice of any character in it? And then the other thing I thought was, just from a choice standpoint, I wanted to feel, I didn't want it to feel radio theater. I didn't want it to feel like we were creating scenes to mimic Hitchcock and so on. I wanted it to seem more like a storybook. When you're reading a story to a child, you're playing every role, but you're reading the story nonetheless. And the child gets that, these are different characters, and that's well understood. And I think that's true in this audio too. So I try to do it that way. My conception of this is, the way I like to describe it to people, and the description I think works pretty well, is as an audio graphic novel.
Right. Because
it's a lot of short vignettes that are told with a lot of atmosphere, and then we move on to the next vignette. So it is literally like panels in a graphic novel, kind of, except with audio. That's kind of the thinking going through it.
You mentioned that this, as a written product, was, what did you say, 180-page narration here?
Yeah, I think I might have had more than double space, like, triple space or something. But yeah, it was 180 pages of content.
I should have asked you this earlier. When did this process start?
I think I pitched it last August, September, and they said yes, and then I had to get about writing.
That's right, because you pitched it with the 5 minutes, right?
Yeah, that process took a couple of months, and then the recording took a couple more months, and then the approval process, getting all the chapters approved, took some extra time. And so it was ready by January. And then we just waited until a couple of weeks ago to start rolling it out.
I'd like to ask, because they've been very good to me here on my show, what's it been like working with Hernan Lopez and the Wondery team?
Well, the Wondery guys have been great. I mean, I originally went to them, in fact, because I knew where they sourced from, that they came from Fox yep. International and Fox TV. And my feeling was, I want to work with people who understand stories with beginnings, middles, and ends. I didn't want to do the kind of show that was, there's nothing wrong with a show that's, every week something topical, but that wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to do something with a beginning, a middle, and an end. I wanted to do something that was, in some sense, evergreen, so that you could come back to it. I mean, I think
sure.
If anybody who hasn't heard it by Halloween will really enjoy listening to it at Halloween.
Oh, that's a great recommendation.
So, I mean, if
if I decide to do a rerun, Mark, maybe I'll replay this conversation the week of Halloween.
Well, that leads to the question, well, gosh, why not release it Halloween time, or release the next one Halloween time? And that's definitely on my mind, because that would make some sense. So my intention was, I wanted it to be like, I really thought of this from the beginning as a television show that just happened to have no pictures.
Right.
And when you think of it in that sense, you think of something that has a life beyond its initial run. And that life extends to, this is why Netflix exists, right? From the very beginning. It's because they started with this, this vault of television and film that had been initially purposed elsewhere, on networks and in theaters and so on DVD. And now they were giving it a new life, and the ability to actually dive in and go through every episode in sequence all at once in many cases
right.
was actually a plus. And I think that's one of the benefits after, episode 6 airs or runs, I guess. People can, deep dive into it and take it 1 through 6 and enjoy the whole thing in a 2-hour stretch. And I think there'll be a lot of people who do that down the road, I hope.
Oh, I could almost assure you that folks will definitely enjoy that. That's for sure. I want to talk about another element of the production. We mentioned his name briefly, working with Jeff Schmidt, and I know he had a lot of contributions, but I want to talk about his contributions as well as the sound design in this, because of all the elements we've been talking about, one that I think is going to jump out at folks right off the bat, and that I think really stands it above just about any other show, is the sound design. So I want to know more about how this came together.
Well, Jeff is immensely talented, number one. Number two, he, like I, have long kind of been frustrated by the fact that, people in the audio space where he works every day like I do, aren't really leveraging the power of the medium. He's literally never asked, or almost never asked, to do the kinds of things that we were doing, which made it particularly exciting and thrilling for him. And, the Wondery guys were willing to, pay the freight to make that happen. And that's what made it possible. But I went in at the beginning and said, I want to create something that is like, immersive. And he said, well, you realize you're going to have to write for sound. And I said, absolutely, I do. I want to write. I want to be cognizant of sound throughout this whole thing. And I absolutely want to write for sound. And there are parts of it that are more written for sound than other parts. But on the whole, it's not a lot of podcasts that have sound in the background, even storytelling podcasts. The sound is, I won't say disposable, but an afterthought. Not central to the telling of the story. And here the sound is an equal partner to the telling of the story. And I gave him, a few cues about things that I thought might be important. But on the whole, I wanted him to do whatever he felt would be best doing. So it's a very collaborative process. It's why I think, when you do television and film, you're dealing in a collaborative medium where everyone is an expert at what they do, and they come together, and when they are together, they create this magic that they can't create separately. So that's what this is. I think it's a particular magic that he brings that and again, he's never asked to do it because people aren't putting this kind of stuff in front of him. And that allowed this kind of an amazing collaboration where every time I'd get something back from him, I would say, this is so much better than I could have imagined. This is so much better. And I've often thought that what he's creating takes what I wrote and what I gave him and really takes it to a new level. And it's really some kind of art, in my view. And anyone who really appreciates, and you got to use the headphones, you got to use the earbuds. Don't just, play it on the speaker on the laptop or God forbid, on the iPhone.
Or the
use
car.
The headphones.
Or the car.
Or even the car. The car's a little better than the iPhone or the laptop. But, use the headphones or the earbuds because it really makes a huge difference. And he designed it that way.
Yeah, it sounds wonderful. And I found myself as a listener with a much more discerning ear doing this now for the last 2.5 years and running through literally hundreds of shows. And for something from a sound design standpoint to stand out to me now, it has to be pretty clear a high bar at this point because I've heard so many things. And there are, to be fair, there are a few other shows that are definitely making it an element. In fact, I'll point to one that is another Wondery show, Terms. I thought that team there did a great job with their sound design as well, but it was a different element, a lot more environmental sounds and adding to a story in a very different way where I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, if I'm classifying this incorrectly, but it's almost like there is creating an environment or setting a tone or almost an ambient contributory nature to the sound design you guys used in Inside Psycho.
Well, we wanted the audio to be the co-star of the show, without question. And we really wanted to create something that made people recognize the difference in the experience and to feel part of it. I didn't want to simply tell the story of what happened. I didn't want that. I mean, there are podcasts out there that do that kind of thing. I didn't want it to be an endless string of trivia. I wanted it to create scenes in your head in which you were present. And I also wanted to stay clear of so-called, radio drama for that reason, because I think that I didn't want it to be a show you weren't a part of.
Yeah, and when I say environmental, what I mean by that is that I can visualize the environment. There's a scene, and I don't want to give away too much because folks can subscribe right now, catch back up, 5 and 6 are coming, but there's a scene where Hitchcock attends the opening. And the sound design in that particular sequence, I can visualize the car parked on the street, him getting out of it, what he sees, what happens next, and not just through the narration and the writing that you put together, which obviously goes a long way to this visual, but through that sound design, I almost feel as if I've seen that happen. And it was brilliant. I loved just one particular moment of several that stands out when I think about that.
And that's Jeff, and that's the ability that to create a scenario and set it to Jeff, and he's able to bring that to life. That's the beauty of it. And the other thing I think that we did that's kind of interesting that some people are, have a difficult time getting their head around is this is kind of it's inspired by the story behind the making of the film, but not every moment is it's not a documentary. It's more like a biopic.
Right.
And some people don't get this. There's a story in it that happens, I won't say where, but you'll know where. And a few people have said, is that true? And I said, well, no, that's not true. But the point of that story is to tell a larger truth that is true. And this is the difference between making a movie and making a documentary. So I view this more as a movie than a documentary. And it's funny. The people who have the most depth in the space, the people, I guess, who are most accustomed to listening to journalism stories where truth is the only metric, right?
Right.
Hear it one way, but people who come, there was one guy who's an actor in a television series, and I said, you realize not every moment of this is true in the literal sense. He said to me, of course. So it's funny. I mean, when you're in the so-called industry, you get it. But when you're accustomed to hearing things that are true in a documentary sense, you struggle with it.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking to myself, well, would you have wanted to put a disclaimer on there? But I don't think that would have been the right move either, because wouldn't you say that an overwhelming majority of what you're portraying happened, yes?
Well, yes, but it may not have happened quite the way it's presented.
Right.
Or may not have happened in the place that it's presented, or maybe the words weren't exact. I mean, but why do people expect otherwise? No one expects that of a movie. There was one of the source books that I have for the show is called Alfred Hitchcock and the Making of Psycho by Stephen Rebello. That book was made into a movie a few years ago called Hitchcock. Now, would you expect every moment of that movie Hitchcock to be true?
Well, no, and
No,
I think that's
it's a movie.
the medium.
It's a movie
the
with
medium doing that to people.
Well, that's the medium. And what I'm trying to say through this show is welcome to the real world audio, because there's no reason that audio should function according to different rules just because most of what's famous about audio comes from people born in public radio where their roots are in journalism. There's no reason at all. That the fact that the movie Hitchcock do you need to see Anthony Hopkins in it to know that it's not literally true?
Right.
I mean,
that would be a dead giveaway.
Well, you say it's a dead giveaway. Well, guess what? When I read the words of Hitchcock, is that not also a dead giveaway? I mean, when you read a biography of someone who's going off memory, is that necessarily true? When you watch The People versus O.J. Simpson on FX, do you expect that to be documentary? I mean, it's the same thing all the way across the board. And the truth of the matter is that the reason why movies exist as different from documentary, why The People versus O.J. is not a straight, textbook rendering of the court documents, is because you can use a medium to tell a story that is bigger than the story you think you're telling, and you find the truth in the story by telling a bigger story, not by just relating the facts end to end.
Well, it's 2017 in the U.S., Mark. Truth is a very debatable thing nowadays anyway, so we can go down a huge rabbit hole of truth at this point.
I think what I'm trying to suggest is that it's always been so, and that the biggest truths that we see portrayed in any popular medium are the things we feel, not the fact of what's on the screen, on the page, or in your ears.
Well, it's defining entertainment, right? And under the umbrella that is entertainment, the majority of people do not have necessarily an expectation of 100% factual representation because it's a movie or an entertainment-based TV show or whatever the case may be. So, yes, in that regard, you're right. And that's where podcasts, to a large degree, have been underserved. There have obviously been some fictional stories, some radio dramas, those type of things out there. And that's going to be one of those interesting tidbits is that, is there a space between that true fiction and that total fiction and that true reporting? And that's if I understand you correctly, where you were trying to land more
Of
from
course.
a factual based, but not necessarily a complete factual representation of in service of a larger story.
Well, of course. I mean, is there anything to learn from the TV series Feud simply because it's not a documentary? Do we expect everything that happened in Feud to be true? There are characters in Feud that don't exist in real life. I mean, that's by definition false.
Most of the reality TV shows are not real.
Well, but
anyway.
Feud isn't a reality TV show. Feud is a scripted show.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that one.
Yeah, that's the in this season it's Betty Davis, Joan Crawford. So it's real people and realish experiences and real facts brought to life in a way that can be more impactful. You can understand the characters better by the introduction of fiction than you can by simply relaying an endless series of fact. Not only that, but you can make it more interesting, not just more entertaining, more interesting, more compelling, more impactful, and more emotionally resonant. And that's what I'm trying to do with this show. And I'm trying to tell a story in this case with a hero who happens to be Hitchcock in this case, where you get a sense of him that you may not have had before. I mean, there's this weird sense of Hitchcock, this man above the fray, this guy who loves blondes and loves movies, and this kind of the icon of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And what I tell is a story of a guy who's actually very vulnerable, who is taking a lot of chances, who has a lot of doubts, and who isn't at all sure of himself, and who finally can't understand why, despite all his achievements, the peers, the people he spent his career working with, don't give him respect. And I think ultimately it's more of a tragic story than it is a story of success. And, that's a side of him that I think people don't know. And that's a side that really you can best tell in the way I hope that I told it.
Well, it definitely taught me a lot and entertained in all kinds of ways. And I wanted to ask you another bit. You mentioned it in passing, and I believe I read it somewhere online in our preparation for our conversation today. You're going to be doing this again?
Well, that's what I believe. It seems to be the case. I mean, I'm just waiting for a few details to be ironed out with the folks at Wondery, but the expectation is that we'll be doing it again. If we do it again, I can't tell you what it's going to be.
No, that's
or I should say, I won't tell you what it's going to be.
There you go. But it is safe to say it's a movie.
It's safe to say it's a movie.
There you go. Will it be called the Inside series? I kind of like that.
Inside is
next movie.
Inside is viewed as the franchise, so yes.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, and are you up for suggestions? Because I can have everybody email you and find you on Twitter and tell you they want to go inside something.
Well, the fact of the matter is I would be foolish not to be interested in suggestions because I'm better off, following what people are interested in than, essentially taking it my own way. I mean, the only issue is I need to deal with things for which there's some scholarship out there. There needs to be some, somebody needs to do the groundwork.
Sure.
And in the case of Inside Psycho, there was a very limited number of living people that one could talk to, and I was fortunate enough to be able to find one. I talked to Anthony Perkins, a good friend from his days as an actor in L.A. before and during and after Psycho, Paul Jasmine, who, as it turned out, was one of the voices for Norman Bates' mother. And that story is told in one of the episodes. I think it's the episode 3, I think. Yeah. The story of how that came about, and that's kind of a quirky story that a lot of people don't know. But what began as a prank call with a funny voice turned into the voice of Norman Bates' scary mother.
Yeah, it was, and that's why I'm asking about, are we going to do this again type deal? Because you did bring up a lot of things. Like I said, that I learned a whole bunch. I was a little bit young. I guess I'd say I'm 38, so I vaguely remember it. I did see the remake, and you do mention this, and I don't want to spoil your comments. I believe it's either 5 or 6. It's towards the end. But
it's
you
6.
Six. Okay. You do definitely cover that ground. And like I said, I don't want to spoil that, but I did see that. And the thing that made me basically go back and see the original after seeing the remake and being like, it can't be this heralded and held in such high regard if this was it.
That's another thing. It's an interesting thing to mention because I think, one of the things that's not well understood is this is the kind of show that will bring more attention to the original film. Right. Because at this point, it's a movie kind of everybody's seen or everybody's deliberately avoided because it's too scary, one or the other. But, it does kind of remind people, hey, you may want to check this out again. I saw it not that long ago on TCM, and I decided to live tweet it because, I knew some stuff about it. And you encounter all the folks who know a lot about it, and they're all tweeting at each other while the movie's on. But, you remember certain aspects of it which really do hold up really, really really well. And I think I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I will say this. If Universal reaches out to Wondery and says, can we include Inside Psycho on our next, reissue of the Psycho DVD, I think there might be a deal to be made there.
There you go. No, that sounds like a great idea, honestly. Yeah, as a hidden or a special feature. That's the term I'm looking for on the special feature on the re-release. Well, does it have an anniversary? Well, let's see. No, 2020, right?
Yep,
I guess
2020.
Would be 60th
that
anniversary.
Would be the 60th. Yes.
So there you go. Hey, completely possible. Anything can happen. Well, Mark, if people would like to check out Inside Psycho, catch up to the release, or if they're listening down the road, binge listen as we were describing earlier, how can they find it and how can they find you?
Well, Inside Psycho is a Wondery show. You can find it at InsidePsycho.com. It'll send you right over to the page on Wondery. You can also find it wherever you get your podcasts or audio experiences, as I like to term it. Just search Inside Psycho. You'll find it. It's also on Twitter at It's Inside Psycho and on Facebook at /Inside Psycho. So I got all that right.
Yeah. That's what I've got in my notes, and those links will be in the show notes. And I was going to ask you, there's got to be something here. The Twitter handle, It's Inside Psycho. That leads me to believe Inside Psycho was taken, and I'm really concerned for who's got that account. Because it makes me wonder.
Hopefully he's getting a lot of Twitter traffic that he doesn't deserve right now.
Yeah, well, with a name like that, you got to wonder. I don't know if I'd want to talk to that guy, to be honest with you.
As I recall, I don't think he has a lot of action. I think it's more of a parking situation than anything else.
Squatting on it, probably.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, that happens. Well, folks, as I mentioned, all those links will be in the show notes, as always. So, Mark Ramsey, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
And that'll do it. What do you guys think? Are you going to go over and check out Inside Psycho? Yeah, it's awesome. And as you may have heard in that conversation, I've already heard all 6 episodes. Folks over at Wondery were nice enough to let me in on that. And believe me, it's awesome. And so 5 and 6 are coming out, and you need to hear how this thing wraps up. And if you haven't started, go start now. So if you enjoyed this conversation or any of my conversations, tell a friend, folks. I want to see you tweeting about it, Facebook about it, Pinterest about it. Tell a friend, all that fun stuff. Follow me on Twitter at Pod Digest if you're not doing it already. That is where I'm the most chatty and talk the most and share a bunch of crazy fun stuff. Most of it podcast related, sometimes about pets. But check it out if you would. And if you're interested in supporting the show, there's a link to the Patreon page for the Podcast Digest in the show notes as well. And also want to thank this week's show sponsor, Fireside, podcast hosting and an analytics platform. It's created by podcasters for podcasters. Check it out, fireside.fm/TPD. You'll get 20% off the standard plan for 3 months if you use the code TPD. My thanks to them as well. Folks, I'll be back again next week with another great interview and conversation. Really excited to bring you guys that one. So stay tuned, subscribe, go through the back catalog while you're waiting for next Sunday morning when the next episode of TPD comes out. Until then, my name's Dan Lizette, and I'll talk to you then.